Welcome to this episode of SDI Encounters, a podcast from SDI, the home of spiritual companionship. I'm Matt Whitney. Brian Plachta is a spiritual director based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Brian joined me for this conversation about spiritual direction and companionship, and he offers really practical advice on being present to the companion while not getting in the way or over-directing the companion's spiritual journey. We began by talking about the notion of failing someone we've been companioning, which relates to an article Brian wrote for Presence Journal, which appeared in the December 2019 issue. Well, let's start. So, Brian, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being willing to come on this podcast. This is kind of how I envisioned the podcast is being this vehicle where I get to know spiritual directors in our SDI community and get to share their stories and the singular ways in which they are practicing spiritual companionship.
Yeah, it's great to connect. Thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work you do as a spiritual companion. What does that look like for you in your day to day?
Sure. So I kind of wear two hats. One is as a lawyer for 36 years here in Grand Rapids, but then really my passion is around being a spiritual director, a writer, and a workshop presenter. As a spiritual director, I work a lot at Dominican Center at Marywood, which is a ecumenical spiritual center here in Grand Rapids. Just work with individual clients, sometimes with group spiritual direction at times too. But then also love volunteering at a local, it's called Guiding Light Mission, which is a local addiction recovery center for men, a 4-month program, which is really interesting that the recovery center, Guiding Light, requires the men there to meet weekly with a spiritual director as part of their ongoing process, just to kind of develop their own spirituality, however they conceive of God as a higher power. So that's always kind of fun. It's always interesting because you meet with the guys one-on-one each week, so you really get a taste for who they are and what's going on in their lives. And it's also challenging because some of the guys leave the program. One of the articles I wrote for the Presence magazine was anonymously about a guy who actually left the program. And it was my real encounter with what do you do when you fail as a spiritual director. But it's really life-giving. There's that giving and receiving. As a writer, I like to take complex theological spiritual concepts and really make them practical for people to really integrate into their lives. Usually it's stuff that I'm chewing on myself. And then I like to take the stuff that I'm learning into the workshop format to help others really grow and integrate their experience of God into their lives too.
That's wonderful. I want to hear more about all of that. I want to begin with the work you do for the Recovery Center.
Sure.
And I read your Presence article. It was in the December 2019 issue, so I guess that was a pretty recent issue.
Yeah.
The story in there was really, really beautiful. Can you maybe give just a quick overview of that experience and how you relate that to the notion of failing and the ways that you experienced that and learned from it?
Yeah, it was a real eye-opener for me. I'm a 1 on the Enneagram, so, I always like to fix things. I'm a reformer, which is certainly a gift, but it's also, the shadow side of that is we sometimes walk into that role that we think we as ones have to change the universe. And so, I think a lot of times with people, particularly with guys in recovery, I had worked with this guy for over 6 months, and he continued outside of the program with me and was really making progress. And he was still living at the Guiding Light. And one day, as I wrote in the article, I walked into Guiding Light to meet with him, and they said, "Oh, didn't you know Tony?" I'll just use a fictitious name that he left. I'm like, and I just was shocked. I mean, I came face to face with my ego, certainly, of, oh my God, I failed. And I first was really angry at the center for not letting me know, like I could have, called him or met with him or something, but then I realized that was just me again. And then I went into this, I tried to look for him for like 20 minutes, a half hour, an hour in downtown Grand Rapids, where there's what's called the Heartside District. And I literally was in this really, egoic state of trying to find him, thinking I could pull him back. And when I realized that, he didn't want to be found, he wasn't going to get found. My first sense in my quiet time with God later that evening was, I failed you, God. I screwed up, basically. And that was the first movement inside of me. And then as I brought that more to prayer and actually talked to my peer group about it, it was, wow, the lesson for me, what the invitation was, we're not God as spiritual directors. We show up, and that's why, at least when I do spiritual direction, I think many of us do at Dominican Center, there's a third chair there. There's the client, the directee, us as a director, but I always try to make sure there's a third chair as a reminder that really the director is God. And so it was a really humbling experience for me to say, you know what, you do the work and you leave the results to God. And so while the article was titled, what do you do when you fail as a spiritual director? I think the reality of it is, as long as we show up, that's what I came to the realization, and we try to be as open and as transparent as a conduit for God, we don't fail. It's personal choices that people make, and really God holds that person more lovingly than we ever could as spiritual directors. And never heard from the guy, don't know where he is, and just lift him up in prayer, basically. So it was a very a hard experience, but a good experience to learn that we're just a conduit in the midst of this ministry that we do.
Yeah, that's a key understanding of spiritual direction that I think most people who are new to spiritual direction maybe don't quite understand or are not quite sure about in regards to the spiritual directors sort of trying to get out of their own way. And
Yeah.
So you keep talking about the egoic state and the letting go. The question that I have, as somebody who is training to be a spiritual director, is what are the ways in which you are both letting go in regards to how you describe, allowing God to be the director, but also being willing to, or at least finding a way to show up in regards to your own person, your spiritual giftings, your presence.
Yeah.
Have you found that line between letting go and showing up?
It's a both and, I think, so for me, what comes to mind is really three pieces to that. One is, as a spiritual director, I need to, outside of the spiritual direction room on a daily basis, be allowing God to continue to transform me. That my own practice of meditation, contemplation, spiritual reading, being in a community with a peer group, and then, using my gifts. I mean, that whole process of transformation is ongoing for us as spiritual directors. I think the first piece is to continue to allow God to shape and form us. The second piece is, I acknowledge when I'm going into, meeting with a directee, I usually am nervous. And one of my directors years ago said, pray for the grace of emptiness. And so as I, move into the meeting, half hour, 20 minutes before, as that nervousness rise up, like, God, just give me the grace of emptiness. And then I love something else that Margaret Gunther writes about is, let me be present to you, God, for this directee. And that's really a huge prayer for me is, if let's say it's Tony is my directee. So as I'm moving into that session, it's, God, let me be present to you for Tony. And that really seems to center me. And I like this vision of, years ago, there's a gal, she was a Buddhist gal, and her name was Ruby. And we were having coffee with her, a buddy of mine. And she says, she lifted her hands over her head and said, the divine flow is really God descending upon us. And then as she moves her head down, towards her head, into her body, into her heart, she says, we receive the gift of God, and then God flows through us. And I love that image really as a metaphor, as I'm sitting with a directee, is really, asking really kind of this quiet conversation with God. God, what was it you would like me to offer to this person? Is there a question? Where do you want me to go with that? So I'm both listening to God as best I can, but also present to the directee as that conduit. So I typically kind of in this contemplative prayer with God in the midst of it. And then I think the third piece is when the directee leaves the room, and I don't always do that perfectly, but really one of our peer group supervisors said to really stay, if you can, for another 5-10 minutes and lift that person back to God, because God loves that person and cares for that person much more than we ever could as directee. And so we lift them back to God in that kind of letting go process. So I think it's that threefold movement for me. One is continue to be formed as a spiritual director individually in my own life, so that I can recognize my own issues and particularly in peer group to work through them. The second is moving into that space, praying for the grace of emptiness, asking that we can be present to God for that person. And then third, after they've left the room, to just lift them back up to God and hold them in prayer. So, but it's not easy. Yeah,
No, I mean, you painted a very, thank you for sharing all that, a very vulnerable picture of what is happening behind the scenes in regards to the inner work of the spiritual companion in the session. I've talked with friends before who, had their first spiritual direction encounter, and they were like, well, the director didn't really say a whole lot. They just sort of sat there and listened. And it's like, there's a lot of work happening there to just be there and listen to.
The funniest story years ago, as a lawyer, it's a completely different way. I mean, clients come in and you analyze the issues. Okay, this is your problem. Here's 3 options, and I think you should do X, Y, and Z. So 25 years ago, when I had my first spiritual direction client, I used the lawyer model that I didn't realize was wrong for spiritual direction. The gal came in, I said, well, honey, I think, you've got this problem. I think you should see a mental health counselor for this, and da-da-da. And she just kind of looked at me and says, I think we're done. And it was like, wow, that was another learning experience of, you don't go in as a lawyer or even as a social worker and try to fix things. You're really there recognizing the answers are in the person, between them and God. And you're just trying to help them see interiorly where God's leading and nudging them through questions or active listening. Yeah, it's an amazing process, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's one of the main reasons we use the term companionship around here, because we find so many spiritual directors saying that I'm not really directing at all. It's as you described, God is doing the directing and I'm just listening. And so we talk about companionship in regards to sort of walking alongside people as they find their way to the divine.
Yeah.
As a director, I'm doing my finger quotes right now. It's hard. It's tricky.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
There's another image I've been trying to find. I don't know if this is true or not, but there's this old myth of that when camels walk in the desert, they walk side by side to blow the dust out of each other's eyes. And I've been trying to find where that quote comes from.
That's lovely.
But it really is that companioning thing, as you say, the mentoring thing, is we're just walking alongside another individual with our own experience and listening and trying to help blow dust out of their eyes so they can see their experience of God more clearly.
Yeah. If you've been listening to this podcast, you probably have a good sense of what it means to be on the spiritual journey. If you're curious about this, well, do you ever ask yourself questions around the meaning of life? What is the meaning of your life? Do you know yourself in your truest and fullest sense? Why are you here on this earth? What do you have to offer to the world? How can you be and sit with the inevitable pain, loss, and difficulty that beset us all at times? These are really deep questions, and spiritual companions go to work every day, listening, asking questions, and offering compassion to help people like you find your own answers, workable answers, answers that are personal and practical, that build inner strength and equanimity. A spiritual companion listens to and honors without judgment your unique spiritual journey. Spiritual companions help each person find balance in the adventure of their lives and practice compassion with all whom they encounter. SDI is the home of spiritual companionship, and we believe everyone should have a spiritual companion. If you're interested in finding a spiritual companion, please check out our resource on our website, the Seek and Find Guide, a database of over 7,000 spiritual directors, chaplains, and life coaches from around the world who are available to companion with you on your own spiritual journey. The Seek and Find Guide is available on our website, sdiworld.org. In regards to the Recovery Center and the work you do there, and thank you for that work, I imagine that you encounter people that may not know necessarily where to begin, right? So you described that the spiritual direction provided through the Recovery Center is, I don't want to say compulsory. It's part of the paradigm of it, right?
Yep, exactly.
Somebody's not necessarily choosing spiritual direction. They don't necessarily know what they are getting into. And, I presume a lot of them have religious history or spiritual background or relationship to God, but also maybe that some don't. And I wonder if you meet somebody who isn't sure, like they sit down with you for the first time, they're like, I don't know what I'm here. I don't know what this is for. Sure. What are some heart awakening questions that you would offer somebody who is just experiencing this
Sure.
relationship for the first time?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I try to do is, one, just ask if they have any questions, first of all, but also and just give them an overview that really the sense of spiritual direction, again, is that God is a director, or their higher power is a director, and I'm here as a conduit to help them draw closer to their experience of God and to name what may seem very ordinary to them, but really to help them experience God directly in their lives. I think that for me, one of the most important questions is really, do you believe in God or a higher power? Because, for example, a recent directee of mine I just got assigned to, he calls himself an atheist. It's like, okay, where do we go with that? Do you believe in a higher power? Is there something beyond you? He says, right now it's my AA group. I said, okay, great. And the companionships, the love we have for their, so trying to be very sensitive to not tell him or teach him, oh, no, you're wrong and there is a God and da-da-da, So the first question I think is, who is God to you? And then the next question I often use is, okay, and really invite them to use a phrase, a word, an image of who God is to them, so that they can really quantify it as a relationship, not an intellectual endeavor, but really, if God is real and God does speak to us in our own unique ways, albeit not typically with an audible voice, it is a relationship. So who is God to you? And so some people may say it's the divine spirit. It may be my AA group. It might be God, or the Father, or, my brother, my friend. So really kind of working with that, as a beginning place, is who is God to you? And then the follow-up question is, if it's a relationship with God as one part of the relationship, but you as the other, God who is love, what would God call you? What would be the word, the metaphor, the image that God would use for you? And that always seems to be the hardest question, I think, for all of us, myself included, is, wow. And the idea being, the minute you go to the negative, well, that's not the God of love speaking to you. I'm an idiot. I'm a jerk. I screwed up. I'm a loser. It's like, well, that could be your own voice. It probably isn't the voice of God speaking to you. So, really, what would God, who is love, what would the voice of love, what would he, she, it call you? So, and then you play around with that, I think the next question is, I often ask them, do you meditate? Do you have I call it quiet time, because I think that word prayer for all of us has a lot of different connotations. Meditation means one thing, contemplation. So it's just really, do you have some quiet time in the morning where you like to just be alone in solitude with yourself and God? And what does that look like? And so that's kind of the third piece, is inviting them to really establish that quiet time so that they do begin to directly experience God in whatever ways. And maybe talking about, if they do have some type of meditation practice, what does that look like to them? What's life-giving for them? And then go with whatever it is that seems to be working. And then inviting them to bring the experiences they have both in that quiet time throughout the week or month, and also throughout the day. Where are they experiencing the presence of God? Where are they recognizing? I like to use the Where's Waldo thing, from when my kids were young, we had all those Where's Waldo books where he's buried in there. It's like, where's God? Where's God? Where did you see God today, or the presence of God today? Yeah. So.
What a great metaphor, the Where's Waldo. Imagine looking over the 2-page spread of my day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
God.
Exactly. And I think that, as Richard Rohr and James Finley, a couple of my teachers, certainly remind us, the only way we can really speak about God is through metaphors, because we cannot intellectually understand or contain God. We can only say God is like, finding where's Waldo, or I think those metaphors are also helpful, at least for me, particularly as a writer. I live my world in metaphors, basically.
Yeah, of course. We here too. I mean, whenever we're talking about divinity, all our language is contingent. Even when we're talking about meditation just now, it's like, well, what is happening in that quiet time as you described it? It looks very different. It looks different for me from day to day. It might look more like centering prayer one day, and another day it might look more like a sort of self-emptying. Another day it might be more like a mantra, and another day it might be like all of them kind of mixing up as it goes. And
exactly, yeah.
And the names of God too, kind of move. There's so many. None of them is the name, right? It's all.
And as that name changes, the relationship changes. So being aware of that's for myself and directees is when someone comes and says, my name for God today has really changed. It's the divine spirit. Well, tell me about that. What does that mean? Because it means their relationship with God is changing in some way. As you say, for all of us, it does change, and that it should change. I think about my wife. Sometimes I call her sweetie, sweetheart, Denise. That my names for her change as hers do for me too. And the other metaphor for me is when our kids were young, we always did a God date or a spouse date. Her and I, we were really intentional about once a week, get a babysitter, go out and do a date night, basically. Oh. And I think about that quiet time with God is really that daily God date, and so again, if it's a relationship, sometimes with my wife, it's like, oh, let's go out and, go to a movie tonight, or let's go out to dinner, or let's just sit here and hold hands by the fireplace. I think it's the same thing with God, in that quiet time, it's really, like you say, it changes. So it might be just starting that quiet time for me with, what do you want to do this morning, God? Do you want to listen to pray as you go? Do you want to do some centering prayer? Do you want to do some body prayer? I mean, where are we at today, God? And just really kind of letting God and myself, what's going to be life-giving in this hour or whatever period of time that, you're going to do the God date thing in the morning.
Yeah. When you bring up a really beautiful counterpoint too, which is just, how does God name you? Yeah. And that most of us don't really think about that. What are our names for God?
Yeah. Yeah, it's powerful. I mean, I think what it adds is, I mean, I was raised Catholic and continue to practice Catholicism, but I think, my early experience was this intellectual relationship with God. Like,
Yeah.
it was always out there outside of myself, and then slowly, as went through different experiences, all of a sudden, I realized finally what the Protestants say is, do you have a personal relationship with God? But I experienced it in a different way, not like this baptism of, but more a sense of, wow, there is this intimate, this God of the universe that created the stars and the moon and the skies. God wants to speak to me and you in our own unique ways. So it is a relationship on the inside. And if we have a name for God, then yeah, like you said, what's God's name for us? Who are we in the sight of God? Sometimes it's beloved. Right now, the word I'm really like, it's really changing me is we are the divine essence of God. And James Finley says we are not God and we are not other than God.
Yeah.
Another one of my teachers says God dwells in us as us. And those understandings, about who I might be in relationship to God, wow, they're really transforming me. I'm just holding them like sipping a good cup of tea, or a good glass of wine, letting that that's how you see me, God. Yeah, I'm not God, but God dwells in me as me. God dwells in you as you. Wow, that's a different relationship. It's much more intimate all of a sudden, So I think it is paying attention to those shifts in how God sees us, or we're understanding God in relationship to ourselves. It can be really, really deep, Yeah.
Yeah, it's a powerful idea. It's one that I've kind of come to practice over the last year for myself, and
yeah,
I kind of have to be careful in the way that I talk about it, because it also can be a little bit heretical depending on who you're talking to.
Exactly. Yeah, I wrote a blog once. My blog each week that goes out to about 1,000 people. And one guy unsubscribed. He says, "You're suggesting that you're God," and he unsubscribes and sends me a nasty email. And I thought, no, I'm not saying I'm God, but God does dwell in us. And I love that's what Finley says is we're not God, but we're not other than God. And that's God gave us the Holy Spirit, the Christian tradition that dwells within us. And so there is that sense of we are the divine presence of God revealed in our own individual lives in a unique way. So yeah.
Yeah, it's powerful. It's and paradoxical, and but it's something good to contemplate, I think.
It really is. Yeah,
it's not something you can really. I mean, you can sort of do some thinking, some intellectual, theological work around that, but it's more of a experiential knowing. It's body knowing. It's that intimate level of relationship that you describe.
Yeah,
and as you do that. So how can it not be that way? How can God not be that way? I think is what you end up coming to.
Yeah. There's even, I think of, I love to take scripture too, and particularly the New Testament, and put ourselves in where Jesus was. And, there's that point when Jesus is, just about thrown off the ledge by his townsfolk, basically. And shortly thereafter, he goes to Peter and he says to Peter, "Tell me who I am." And, you can, and again, scripture being, something that you can, is midrash, as they say, that has different interpretations and it speaks to us. I often think of that. I wonder if the human part of Jesus was like, I don't know who I am anymore. Am I really the Son of God that hears to say, and he needed Peter to mirror back to him, no, you are the Son of God. And you don't let the people tell you otherwise. And at that same sense of maybe Jesus, even at times, the human part of Jesus needed, Peter and maybe the other disciples, tell me who I am. And then Jesus mirrors back to Peter, and Peter, you are rock. It's like, oh, okay, wow. It's like how affirming that is that they mirror back to each other. They are in relationship to God. And,
that's beautiful. Yeah. Rather than self-define, ask the spiritual companion, who am I? How do you see?
Yeah.
I want to ask you about being a lawyer and sort of wearing these multiple hats in a vocational sense. So you're a practicing lawyer and a spiritual director and a retreat leader and all these other things.
Right. Yeah.
How do you balance that? And how do you? It sounds like you have to do one to sort of pay the bills, the tent making work, as it were.
Right. Yeah. So interesting story. The paradox of how God works through different aspects of our life, kind of that like a river that goes different ways. So when I was at Aquinas in undergrad, I thought I wanted to be a priest and or a lawyer. Talk about a paradox, And I wasn't sure. It was, my senior year of college. I had this amazing relationship with my girlfriend, who then ultimately became my wife. I fell in love with her. We loved each other. I was signed up for law school, but I'd gone on a number of retreats, and I was honest with her, saying, I'm not sure if I'm called to be a priest or not. So interesting how I stumbled into spiritual direction. So a friend of mine said, well, why don't you go meet with Bishop Gumbleton and just have dinner with him? Okay, I guess so. And so Gumbleton and I were talking and just had a great conversation. And he had a little like a quilt on his legs, and we were at his house. And he said, he flipped it over and he says, look at all the threads on underneath this quilt. On the surface, it looks really normal, but if you flip it over, there's a thread that runs through that. And he said, I would encourage you to look at the tapestry, the thread of your life. You've signed up for law school, you've been accepted, you've got this great wife. You feel maybe this nudge to be a lawyer, but your life is heading in a different direction, and in a good direction too. So he said, I would encourage you to follow that thread. But he said, I'd like you, when you go to law school, to meet once a month with this priest. I went to school in law school in Detroit, outside of Detroit, this priest. And it was really, I didn't realize it then, but he was introducing me to spiritual direction. So I go once a month to see this priest while I was in law school, and just talking about my life and da-da-da. I got married, I had 4 kids, great experience as a lawyer, but always had this nudge that there was something more. And even in the sense of, well, maybe I let God down because I wasn't a priest, And so probably 25, 30 years ago, I went on a week-long retreat and just really was like, whoa, and I came back and I told my wife, I said, honey, I think I found the way. She says, what are you talking about? I said, if I become an Episcopalian priest and get ordained, I can come into the Catholic Church as a married priest. And so I think that's where God's leading me. And she just kind of looked at me, talking about a good spiritual director, and my wife said, if you want to do that, you can, but I'm not going with you. And she said, I think you should really talk to our director of religious ed at our church, Joanne. And so I went and met with Joanne, and Joanne said, I would really encourage you to find a spiritual director. You've had obviously a deepening of your faith life. And the God nudge here is, how do you bring that back to, integrate it into your real life? So really that was my older introduction to spiritual direction. And Joanne referred me to Dominican Center. So I've been in spiritual direction for 35 years. My wife is like, oh, thank God, somebody's going to help him other than me try to, get him to get off this high horse or ego trip he's on. And then, I continued as a lawyer. But I always sensed that, again, that was kind of my tent making job, and that the ministry of spiritual direction and writing and all that just slowly evolved. I took a Catholic, there's a Catherine of Siena Institute has a spiritual gifts inventory. There's a number of them out there. And I took that in my 30s and, recognized the gifts were my writing, encouragement, leadership, and teaching. And that kind of helped shape, encouragement. That certainly I do that as a lawyer, but there was that nudge to go on and become certified as a spiritual director. And so that encouragement gift came from that, the teacher, the workshop. So, and then certainly the writer, as I continue to write blogs and different books, one I'm writing now called Finding Flow. So it just kind of evolved, and I recognized that my life wasn't, if I just left being a lawyer all of a sudden, my wife and kids would go, who in the heck is this God that you think you're so in love with, Brian? It would be the Jesus in me would be someone that they really would be angry because I left them high and dry. I recognize it was more of a gradual, the tent making would slowly move into the ministry. And so began to kind of get the master's in pastoral counseling and do more spiritual direction, knowing that eventually I would probably sell my law firm to a younger guy and kind of looked for the right person over the years. Kissed a lot of frogs along the way that weren't the right ones, and but slowly the timing was right. It worked out perfectly. And so just kind of what I was practicing law probably 80% of the time, and doing the other stuff, writing and spiritual direction and workshops 20%. And slowly, as I've aged, into my 60s now, it's really reversed where I'm doing the law more 20% of the time and the other more 80%. So it's been that gradual, but that listening, that holy listening, like, where are you leading me, God? And having someone, a spiritual director, help me see where the breadcrumbs were along the way, because I could have really gone down a lot of wrong paths, had I not been.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. It's probably easier for you to identify those breadcrumbs, having walked that path.
Exactly.
They're not so apparent in front of you, but only sort of after you have picked them up and eaten them.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah, I had no idea walking down that path where I was being led. It's kind of that mystery of our lives. I saw a thing today on Instagram. Somebody posted a thing. I've taken the road less traveled, and now I have no idea where I'm at. And I thought that's really a description of the spiritual life, that it is a mystery, and it just invites us to that deeper listening. And it does make clearer sense as we look backwards, as opposed when we're in the midst of that. But again, where I think the whole ministry of spiritual direction for all of us is so important to be listening and that contemplative stance towards life, letting the Holy Spirit guide us. Yeah. So
since that you are, that's where you are practicing faith, just, am I doing this right? Am I taking the right paths? I hope so.
Yeah.
It requires a lot of trust.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah, exactly.
Can you, how did you come to learn about SDI? How did you come to get involved and write for us and all of that?
Yeah, so when I finished the 3-year program at Dominican Center to be certified, one of my mentors in my peer group said, hey, have you ever heard of SDI? And I'm like, no, I hadn't. Well, that's the international community of spiritual directors. And like she was saying, there really isn't a licensing per se or but really SDI is really the credibility, the international group that provides us with the resources and the sense of, I do belong to this international organization. So there's some accountability, she was saying, there's certainly resources. So I just, at her nudging, I joined, and I've really found that just very life-giving. I love the Presence magazine. Every month, or quarter or whatever it comes, I'm like, I love these articles in here. They're just, I feel like I found my community in essence that extends well beyond just the territory of Grand Rapids, Michigan and stuff. It's like, wow, there are other like-minded people out there and sharing our experiences and our hope. So that's been really an amazing experience. I think also the Seek and Find guide has been helpful, just to be able to put it out there, basically the vulnerable, and say, this is what I do. And I've had like 4 or 5 in the last couple of years, individuals contact me through that, basically. I go, oh yeah, I'm on that Seek and Find guide, aren't I? And so that's been really neat. In terms of writing for Presence magazine, that story about Tony, what do I do when I failed as a spiritual director? It just felt like I just felt that God nudge of, this is something that maybe other directors could relate to, because it really was a holistic experience, both humbling and wisdom wise, that God helped me grow. So so it's been a fun journey. It's an amazing organization. And then in Grand Rapids, we're required to actually get insurance as a spiritual director, it's been kind of a new requirement. And so through SDI, there's the agency that will is affiliated, or they endorse SDI. And so that was another good resource for the insurance that they asked us to keep in place annually.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I love hearing about the ways that the organization is helping you, but also in the ways that you are giving back to it. You're witnessing very wonderfully to what we want the organization to be, to be a resource and to be a guild. Brian, is there anything else that I haven't asked you about that you would like to speak to or share?
Yeah, a couple of things I already touched on, but if there's anything that I would, both for myself and others, encourage is, that aspect of as spiritual directors to continue, our meditation practice, our quiet time, whatever that is, our contemplative, and letting God form us. I mean, I used to think years ago that, I'm going to climb the mountain and I'm going to arrive and find enlightenment. It's like, no, that's not it. That's why we call it practice. So for me, that's probably the most important thing is I can continue to do is to be open to how God is forming me now until the rest of the others, they get to the other side, basically. I think the other piece I found really kind of grew out of the living school was that I think spiritual directors, one of the things that we offer, and we shouldn't be afraid to do that, is sometimes some practices that our directees can take into their own lives. So we were called in spiritual, in the Richard Rohr School to develop what would be our kind of our St. Benedict rule of life. And so I came up with I kind of looked at all the spiritual teachers over the generations and really come up with 4 lifestyle patterns that they incorporate in their lives. One was that aspect of solitude, taking that daily time to be alone with God, which probably is the most important piece, I think, for all of us, whether we're spiritual directors or not. But that's really the crux of that one-on-one. How is God leading, guiding me in whatever form that is? And like you said, there's no right or wrong way. I get frustrated. Some teachers will say, well, you got to do centering prayer this way. And if God gives you this amazing word, just stick with this. Like, well, Finley goes, if it's drawing you closer to God, whatever it is you're doing in your quiet time, for God's sakes, continue that. If it's drawing closer to God, like St. Ignatius says, keep doing that. So solitude is one of those 4 quadrants that I often invite my spiritual directees to do. The second is spiritual reading. Who are the teachers through books and reflections and that are really helping you grow along your spiritual journey and gain the wisdom of those that are further along the way. The other is community. Who are you surrounding yourself? I think as spiritual directors, making sure we have a good, strong peer group is really important, a place where you can kind of dump I certainly brought Tony to my peer group to help me in my community, work through that basically, but also our spouses, our partners, faith tradition, who's in our community, spiritual friends that nudge us to grow. And the final piece is really what I call contemplative action, that, how do we discover what our gifts are, maybe through a spiritual gifts inventory, and then in each season of life, how we're being called to use those gifts as a conduit to make the world a better place and stuff. So that's kind of become this whole finding flow has become my mantra and the book that I'm working on, but and workshops that I've been doing. But I think many times I'll bring that into spiritual direction with directees, and they're grateful to have a template. It's certainly not the only template. There's a lot of different things, but my encouragement to directors would be, if you've got some practical tools, it's okay, I think, as my director does with me, is sometimes to teach a little bit. Well, here's a tool that I came across, and you might want to try this or consider this. So I think there is that gentle balance of, yes, we're listening, but we're also, as directors, hopefully we're gaining new insight and wisdom in our own lives. So feeling free to offer some practices that might be helpful as God might put those on our hearts. So yeah.
That's really helpful to hear. It's like, hey, this helped me. It might help you too.
Yeah.
And to be able to move into that encourager mode as well as being this deep listener.
Yeah. Sometimes I just had a guy, I met with just an amazing guy, 30 years old. He's a director of religious education. He's just moving into the contemplative journey, and he's all excited. He's, what's next, Brian? What's next? And so it's like, really, well, would you consider reading maybe some books on contemplation? I mentioned Finley's book on the contemplative heart, or there's a lot of good books out there. So, feeling free to, you might want to consider this. I think as directors, it's okay to do that. Yeah. So how far are you in your journey on in the spiritual direction certification?
I am, I guess I started in August, July, late July, early August. And I'm doing a program through two spiritual directors. One is in Michigan. The other one is in Chicago. It's an inner spiritual guide program called Spiritual Guidance Training. I do my sort of practicum here locally. I'm in Bellevue, Seattle. I have two people that I see for spiritual direction, and then I have a spiritual director, and then I have a supervisor, and get a lot of feedback from my teachers and my peers.
That's neat. Wow.
Yeah, it's professional development for me, right? But I love it too. I resonate with it. It feels it's really meaningful work for me, and I believe in it.
Yeah.
Cool. I can attest to it. Both in the offering of spiritual companionship and in receiving.
Yeah.
That it's meaningful. It's helpful. Yeah. And I believe everyone should have one.
I would agree. Exactly. Yeah. It's there's that giving and receiving in it, isn't it? As a director and as a directee, it's like, it's so amazing to me. I often say to my wife that you get this literally like fly on the wall ability to look into people's very intimate life in a very private way. Obviously, don't disclose it outside of there, but it's amazing that people they need to tell their stories to really connect with where is God and themselves in the midst of that. So keep it up. Good work.
Yeah. Thank you for your work too. And where can people find you, Brian? You have a blog you mentioned, and
so my website is brianplachta.net. So www.brianplachta.net. And feel free to reach out. If you pop in there, then there's a free pop-up to get my last book, which is Life's Toolbox, blueprints included. So there's you can get that for free, and then it signs up if you want to the weekly blog I do that comes out every Monday and stuff. So feel free to reach out.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Brian, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for sharing your story and your work with us.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to talk to you. Have a good one.
If you're enjoying this podcast and you want to help us share and spread the word about the life-giving practice of spiritual companionship, you can help us out by subscribing to this podcast through your favorite app. You could give us a like or even write us a review. Thank you for listening. This is Matt Whitney with Spiritual Directors International. Thanks again for listening. Your time and your presence here are deeply appreciated. If you liked this show and would like us to continue making them, please do subscribe now while it's fresh on your mind. Also, we would love to hear from you, so please feel free to send in your comments and suggestions to the email address podcast@sdiworld.org. To learn more about spiritual companionship and ways that you can plug in and join our community, visit us at our website at www.sdiworld.org. Thank you. Blessings and peace on your day, and may you share blessings and peace to others.